Have you ever noticed how you can sit at your desk for 3 hours staring at a screen, feeling completely mentally paralyzed, but the second you move to a minimalist coffee shop or step into a room with massive windows, your brain suddenly unlocks? Most of us just chalk that up to needing a change of scenery. We think of our physical environment as just a passive container, a backdrop for the real action happening inside our skulls. But what if that is a complete illusion? What if the walls, the lighting, the ceiling height, and even the clutter on your desk are actively programming your nervous system second by second?
That is exactly the shift in perspective that modern neuroscience is forcing us to make. We have this very persistent, almost arrogant belief that human cognition happens entirely in a vacuum, isolated within the brain. But the reality is that the brain never evolved to function independently of physical space. Every single element around you, the geometry of the room, the texture of the materials, the temperature, the acoustic bounce, the color of the light is being absorbed and translated into neurological input. Your environment isn't just a place where you think. Your environment is literally participating in your cognitive process.
That is a profound way to frame it. It implies that architecture is essentially a form of biological engineering. If I'm understanding this correctly, we aren't just reacting to our spaces. Our spaces are actively writing the code for our attention, our memory, and our stress levels.
Precisely. And to understand why, we have to look backward. From an evolutionary standpoint, constant environmental scanning was a non-negotiable requirement for survival. Your ancient ancestors didn't have the luxury of ignoring their surroundings. The nervous system had to continuously evaluate the physical space for safety, visual complexity, potential threats, and escape routes. That ancient software is still running in your brain right now. When you walk into a room, your subconscious is immediately mapping the spatial organization. It is calculating the density of objects, the source of the light, the social dynamics of the space. All of this processing happens far beneath your conscious awareness, but it requires a massive amount of metabolic energy.
So it's like having 50 tabs open in your web browser in the background. You might only be looking at one tab, say the spreadsheet you are trying to finish, but those other 49 tabs are silently draining your computer's battery and RAM.
That is a perfect analogy. Every environment creates a neurological load. The problem is that modern environments are incredibly loud, neurologically speaking. Think about the classic open-plan office. It is a sensory minefield. You have unpredictable acoustic interruptions, constant peripheral movement, harsh artificial lighting, and high visual density. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for your executive function and deep focus, becomes completely overwhelmed just trying to filter out all that irrelevant information.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. No wonder people feel completely drained by 2 p.m., even if they haven't done any heavy lifting. We are essentially fighting our own buildings just to hold a single thought.
Exactly. In many ways, modern architecture has inadvertently become a stress amplifier. Because the nervous system is working so hard to suppress the chaotic stimuli, attention fragments, mental fatigue skyrockets. We rarely give our perceptual systems a chance to recover. We are asking an ancient, highly sensitive scanning mechanism to operate inside a kaleidoscope of fragmented stimuli. And then we wonder why we can't achieve a flow state.
Let's break down some of these specific environmental triggers, because I think people will be fascinated to learn just how granular this gets. I want to talk about spatial geometry, specifically ceilings. I've always felt a strange sense of awe and expansive thinking when I walk into a cathedral or a museum with massive vaulted ceilings. Conversely, if I'm in a basement with a drop ceiling, I feel compressed. Is there actual neurology behind that, or is it just a psychological quirk?
It is deeply neurological, and it's one of the most fascinating areas of neuroarchitectural research. The height of a ceiling demonstrably alters your psychological and neural processing. When you are in a space with high ceilings, it actually primes the brain for abstract thinking, expansive creativity, and complex problem solving. The brain interprets physical openness symbolically, but also biologically, as a space without immediate physical restriction, allowing cognitive boundaries to relax.
That is incredible. So if I need to brainstorm a massive new project or think about a 5-year strategy, I should physically move to a room with high ceilings. But what about the opposite? Are low ceilings always bad?
Not at all. It depends entirely on the cognitive task you are trying to execute. While high ceilings promote abstraction, Lower ceilings actually enhance detail orientation, surgical focus, and task concentration. The slight sense of physical compression signals the brain to narrow its attentional spotlight. So, if you need to do your taxes, write a complex piece of code, or edit a document line by line, a lower ceiling will actually facilitate that state of mind much better than a massive open hall.
So I shouldn't be trying to do my accounting in a cathedral.
Probably not. You would likely find yourself daydreaming about the meaning of wealth rather than actually balancing your ledger.
That makes so much sense. It really reinforces the idea that we should be matching our physical geometry to our intended mental state. Now, what about lighting? Because I feel like lighting is the one thing people intuitively know affects their mood, but they might not realize the sheer biological power it holds.
Lighting is arguably the most powerful neurological variable in any room. We tend to think of light purely in terms of illumination. Can I see what I am doing? But light is actually biological software. It directly programs your nervous system. The receptors in your eyes don't just process visual images. They send direct signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master clock of your brain.
So light is literally telling the brain what time it is, and therefore what chemicals to release.
Precisely. Light dictates your circadian rhythm, your alertness, your mood, and your melatonin regulation. Natural sunlight is the gold standard because its dynamic shifts throughout the day perfectly synchronize our biology. But modern spaces are saturated with artificial blue light, which mimics the high noon sun. When you are exposed to that harsh, static, artificial light, especially late into the afternoon and evening, it fundamentally dysregulates your system. It suppresses recovery hormones, spikes cortisol, and creates attentional instability.
It sounds like illumination is actually metabolic signaling. We are essentially tricking our ancient biology into thinking it's always the middle of the day, demanding peak alertness, which leaves no room for the cognitive recovery required for deep work.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it. Metabolic signaling. When you bathe yourself in the wrong spectrum of light, you are sending a chaotic chemical signal to your brain. You are demanding focus while simultaneously triggering biological stress.
Let's pivot to something that plagues almost everyone. Clutter. There is this romanticized myth of the messy genius. The idea that a chaotic desk is a sign of a highly active, brilliant mind. But based on what you are saying about the brain constantly scanning the environment, a messy desk sounds like a neurological nightmare.
It truly is. Visual clutter is incredibly damaging to deep, sustained focus. Remember, every single visible object in your peripheral vision is competing for attentional processing. The brain has to continuously, subconsciously evaluate every item. It looks at a stack of mail, a coffee cup, a loose charging cable, and a sticky note, and it asks, is this relevant? Do I need to act on this? Is this a threat?
So even if I am staring straight at my laptop, my peripheral vision is essentially interrogating the coffee cup.
Yes, and that creates micro-distractions. It creates decision fatigue. We call it neural friction. The brain has a finite amount of metabolic currency to spend on executive function each day. When your environment is cluttered, you are leaking that currency just to maintain your baseline orientation in the space. Minimalist environments are powerful not because they look trendy, but because they drastically reduce that neural friction. By stripping away the visual noise, the prefrontal cortex can conserve its energy for actual, meaningful work. Simplicity is metabolic efficiency.
That completely redefines how we should look at cleaning our workspace. It's not about being neat for the sake of aesthetics. It is about protecting your cognitive bandwidth. Which leads me perfectly into the concept of flow states. Everyone wants to achieve flow, that magical state of deep, uninterrupted, immersive concentration where time just seems to vanish. How does environmental coherence play into triggering flow?
Flow states are incredibly fragile. They require very specific, highly optimized neurological conditions. Flow emerges when attention stabilizes, when internal and external distractions drop to near zero, and when your cognitive load becomes perfectly coherent. You cannot bully your brain into a flow state if the environment is fighting you.
So you need the room to essentially disappear.
Exactly. Environmental coherence is the prerequisite for flow. This means predictable spatial organization, controlled sensory input, and absolute noise reduction. When the environment is coherent, it stops demanding subconscious attention. The neurological resistance drops. Once the brain realizes it no longer needs to actively monitor the space for threats or anomalies, it can finally surrender to sustained attentional immersion.
It's almost as if architecture can either be an active interruption to your genius or the invisible scaffolding that supports it. And speaking of scaffolding, there is a specific type of environment that humans seem universally drawn to. Whenever people want to relax, they go to the woods, the mountains, or the ocean. Even in interior design, we are obsessed with wood grains, stone textures, and indoor plants. Why is the brain so hungry for nature?
What you are describing is a concept known as biophilia. It is the innate human affinity for the natural world. Again, this goes back to our evolutionary roots. For hundreds of thousands of years, the nervous system evolved strictly within natural environments. So, when you surround yourself with organic geometry, natural textures, plants, and sunlight, the brain recognizes that ecological familiarity.
It's like a homecoming for the nervous system.
Beautifully put. And the biological response to that homecoming is immediate and measurable. Exposure to nature, even just natural elements integrated into an indoor space, rapidly reduces stress signaling. It lowers your heart rate, decreases cortisol levels, and accelerates recovery from attentional fatigue. The ancient brain looks at a wood texture or a leafy plant and says, "This is a life-sustaining environment. We are safe here." And in that safety, cognitive resources are freed up.
It's fascinating that despite all our advanced technology, our brains are still fundamentally looking for the forest, which brings me to a really provocative thought about the future. If we know that ceilings change our creativity, light alters our metabolism, clutter drains our bandwidth, and nature heals our stress, where does architecture go from here? We are entering an era of AI and hyper-personalized technology. Are we going to see spaces that actively adapt to our minds?
I believe we are standing on the edge of a massive revolution in how we build. The future of architecture is going to be personalized cognitive engineering. We are already seeing the convergence of neuroscience, behavioral psychology, lighting science, and human performance optimization. In the near future, your environment will not be static. It will be dynamic and responsive.
Give me an example of what that looks like in practice.
Imagine walking into your workspace, and the room is communicating with your wearable devices. The room knows your current biometric state. It knows if you had poor sleep the night before, so it automatically adjusts the ambient lighting to a specific wavelength to gently elevate your cortisol and sync your circadian rhythm. It knows you have a deep focus task scheduled, so the acoustic dampening activates, the visual environment simplifies, and the temperature drops slightly to promote alertness.
So the building becomes an active participant in my cognitive health. It's no longer just a shelter, it's an extension of my nervous system.
Exactly. We will move away from the idea that humans must adapt to their buildings and move toward buildings that dynamically adapt to the biological and psychological needs of the human. The spaces will breathe with us. They will read our stress levels, our focus demands, and our recovery states, and they will physically alter themselves to reduce neurological friction.
That is both incredibly exciting and a little bit haunting. It really forces us to confront a deeply philosophical question. Where do we end and where does the room begin? We are so attached to the idea of the isolated self, the independent mind. But if the light bulb above my head and the height of the ceiling are co-authoring my thoughts, then mental clarity was never entirely an internal process to begin with.
That is the ultimate realization. The brain does not exist separate from its environment. The boundary between you and the room is a biological illusion. Every room you walk into is handing your brain a set of neurological instructions. Every space is either draining your attention or it is restoring it. There is no neutral space.
No neutral space. That is a heavy, brilliant truth to carry. It means that the future of human performance, of creativity, and even of our own mental peace doesn't just depend on what we do inside our heads. It begins with designing physical environments that are actually worthy of the human mind.
I couldn't agree more. If we want to optimize the human, we must first optimize the habitat.
Next time you sit down to work and feel that familiar wave of mental fatigue, take a look around. The problem might not be your work ethic. The problem might be the room.